was. And if you looked at the makeup assignment I put online, it basically was an earlier version of this lecture that was given, I think, last spring. But at any rate, you know, we saw that Aquinas has what's called a disjunctive argument going, where you say A or B or C, not A, so it must be B or C. Okay, and it isn't C, so it must be B. You know, and so, you know, for Aquinas, well, either things brought themselves into existence, or I think he also brings in the options they may have come from nothing, but there's a first cause of all things, or there's no need for a first cause of all things because the universe is eternal. And this was what Plato thought, that the universe, that the material world was actually eternal as the forms were. And so we saw that Aquinas' strategy is to eliminate those options in a systematic way, you know, where he says, well, you know, things don't move themselves, or, you know, because they would have to be both actually and potentially what they are. In other words, to be moved, you have to be potentially something, and to move something, you have to be actually something. And he says it would be both, and he says you can't have something being actual and potential at the same time. So things didn't move themselves. So you follow back in the sequence, and he says, well, it can't go to infinity because an infinite sequence has no first member, and he's also concerned that if there isn't a first cause, then you don't have any intermediate effects. And he brings this out even more clearly when he talks about efficient causes. So in the first way, then, he says, you know, it's not that the universe is not infinite, or there would be no first cause, but we need a first cause to put intermediate things in motion. Now, of course, you can ask, well, why do we? And even to this day, the argument about whether the universe might, in some sense, be eternal, believe it or not, was not entirely put to rest with the Big Bang. And say a little bit about the Big Bang along the way here. Now, the second version, which we sort of started, was the cosmological argument. Really, all the first three are the cosmological argument, but from efficient causes. And these are causes as we talk about them today. And I started out with this, but just to do a tad of review. Basically, efficient causes produce their effects, and they occur before their effects in time. I mean, the cue ball has to roll toward the 8-ball and hit it, you know. First it hits it, then it sends it into motion, you know. The cause precedes its effect. But, so here again, Aquinas, with this concept of what a cause is, has the same strategy of eliminating possibilities. And he says, well, okay, things can't be the efficient causes of themselves, because if an efficient cause not only produces its effect, but you know, has to precede its effect in time, he says, well, something would have to precede itself to produce itself, would have to exist prior to its existing, which is, you know, an outright contradiction. So he says, well, that's impossible. So we can eliminate the possibility that things are the efficient cause of themselves. But here again, and here he makes it a little clearer, and we looked at this last time, that he thinks that if you had an infinite series, you would have no first cause, but without a first cause, you don't have any intermediate causes along the whole chain, and you don't have any, well, I have ultimate cause, but it really should be ultimate effect. The ultimate effect, in other words, is what's going on now. We say, well, okay, we have things existing now, and we have a whole causal chain leading up to where we are today. And obviously he's arguing that we need a first cause to get stuff in motion. So he says if things were infinite, there wouldn't be any first cause, but if there's no first cause, then there are no intermediate causes, and of course no ultimate effect. And so he says, well, we need a first cause. So he says if we take away the cause, we take away the effects of it. So now he's eliminated, he believes, the possibility that that no first cause is needed, because just everything's infinite. You don't need a first cause. But you say, well, if everything is infinite and just exists infinitely, do you need a first cause? I mean, in other words, a lot of people don't think his argument works to say, there had to have been a first cause of that infinite series. And Leibniz throws in a whole different discussion in response to a criticism David Hume gives to this argument, but we're not going to get off onto those tangents because your book really doesn't discuss it. But at any rate, so Aquinas, says you can't have efficient causes to infinity. So he says we have to have had a first efficient cause to get it all going. And what would that first efficient cause be? But God himself. Now, here's a point that's often made. And this may be a good place to make it, even though we have one more, which actually is the most complicated one. I simplify it a lot. And your book does not quote the third way. The third way is a complicated one. But, well, you can say, well, suppose we just lay aside the Bible and church tradition and just work from this argument itself. One thing to ask yourself is, well, would we have just from the rational argument the conclusion that even if there is a first cause, that it's the personal God of the Bible and church tradition, as opposed to, say, Aristotle's impersonal prime mover, or something else. And in other words, if you just make the arguments stand by themselves, one point that David Hume pointed out years later is that more than one conclusion is possible here. Now, if you're like many theologians and you say, well, okay, my primary reference for my faith is what I take to be a revelation, whether it be the Bible, Book of Mormon, Quran, something else. discuss these arguments as kind of icing on the cake. You know, it's nice that we can also talk about these rational arguments. But one of the people that Hume portrays in his three dialogues concerning natural religion, where he criticizes these arguments, is the sort of intellectual that was around in Thomas Jefferson's day, the deist who said, you know what, I don't want to talk about, you know, some of these things like miracles and all that, and basing your faith on miracles. I want my faith to be a rationally based faith on these things like these arguments. And I think rightly, David Hume pointed out, but that if you just go from the arguments themselves, more than one conclusion is possible. In other words, even if they prove that some first cause is necessary, you don't get all the way to where Aquinas wants to get just with the arguments themselves. In other words, that the first cause is, you know, God as portrayed in traditional theism. So these types of arguments are kind of limited, which is one interesting thing about the ontological argument. If it does go through, and I said people still discuss as to whether or not it works or not, the God whose existence it proves is pretty much the God with the attributes that traditional theists think God has, you know. Whereas these arguments from nature don't quite go all the way. So Aquinas, you know, concludes that God is the first efficient cause of all things. Now, the third way has to do with how things exist. In other words, look at the tables and chairs in this room. There's no law built into the foundation of the universe that said these had to ever exist. You know, and what's more, even though they now exist, you know, at some time they're going to wear out and, you know, be discarded or broken up or whatever, and so they'll go out of existence. Well, and so there's nothing necessary about their existence. And things that whose existence is not necessary, we use the word contingent. In other words, their existence is dependent on something else. You know, someone had to make one of these tables and chairs. And so the third way contrasts possible existence with necessary and contingent existence. So things as they are in nature are usually considered to be contingent. They exist, but it's possible that they wouldn't have existed. But now, here is where we bring in nothing. If everything Aquinas says we're in the contingent category, then if we go far enough back, if there were nothing that exists necessarily, then he says there would be a point at which nothing existed. In fact, and I always forget, I think it was one of the continental philosophers, but he said the most profound question in philosophy is, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does anything exist? Not why do we exist, you know? Why is there something rather than nothing, you know? So what Aquinas is going to try to say is, you need at least one necessary being hanging around to explain the existence of contingent things. Because if everything were contingent, he says, at one time nothing would exist. But, you know, what is it? Ex nihilo est or something. From nothing, nothing comes. You know, if at one time nothing existed, then nothing would have begun to exist. So we wouldn't have anything existing now. In other words, he says you're not going to have something coming from nothing. You know. Now again, there were theories like the steady state theory, and even when I was in school, it was argued as a significant alternative to the Big Bang theory. And the steady state theory said, well, I mean, molecules and atoms just sort of sprang into existence and they ultimately congealed into larger bodies. So basically he's going to try to say, if we look around us, you know, we obviously have an existing world, but it's a world of contingent things. If everything were contingent, there would have been a time when nothing existed. And since contingent things are not eternal in their existence. Now, I've never quite understood this point. Because, you know, I want to say, well, why couldn't we just have had an infinite string of contingent things? But maybe I'm missing something here. But at any rate, so he wants to then eliminate the possibility that things could have sprung from nothing that are contingent. So he says, since something now exists, it can't be the case that everything's contingent and merely possible. You have to have at least one necessary being. And now, see, I always thought the next part of his argument is unnecessary and redundant. I think he may have had in mind things like, I mean, angels are supposedly created, but they exist eternally. So in one sense, you could say they're necessary beings. It seems like once you say that there's a necessary being around, you're pretty much saying there's an eternal being around. That, you know, but he says you can't have, for some reason, and this you know what, I simplified this, and actually it's probably a good move that I did. But Aquinas actually tries to eliminate the possibility that you can have a string of necessary beings who aren't self-sufficiently necessary, but they get their necessary existence from something else. I've never quite understood. I think he has something like angels in mind, but and so he tries to, again, like in the other arguments, say you can't have an infinite series of necessary beings that get their necessary existence from some other being. You've got to, at the beginning of it all, have a self-sufficiently necessary being, and that being, again, he says, is God. Again, I'm not asking you to understand all the subtleties of these arguments, but now, before leaving this, as you probably saw from the movie, the contemporary version of of this, I mean, the most prevalent cosmological theory is the Big Bang theory now. But even, and of course, the Big Bang theory seems to fit in well with the idea that the universe had a finite beginning in time, you know, at the Big Bang, and so it would help rule out what Aquinas wanted to rule out, that the universe is infinite and does not and never needed a first cause. Now, the thing is, first of all, I don't know much about black holes. Okay, there's a black hole in my knowledge about black holes. So one point that was made is that maybe it's the other side of a black hole. I don't know what to make of that objection to the Big Bang theory, but I do know that you've all gone to a 4th of July fireworks display, right? You know, you have these ones that are going up, and you see boom, and you know there's this brilliant, you know, globe-shaped firework, and then it starts to burn itself out. Well, even after the Big Bang theory, there still was a discussion about whether or not, and this was pointed out in the video, but it goes by so fast, unless you're looking for it, you miss it. There was a discussion as to whether or not we could still have a way of talking about the universe as eternal. And it was what they called the oscillating universe. Something that oscillates goes back and forth, right? I mean, I've been a ham radio operator since 14, and, you know, radio oscillations, we're talking about waves going back and forth. But do we have an oscillating universe? In other words, the question is the universe, if it started out in the Big Bang and everything is moving away from us, as Hubble discovered early in the 20th century, the real person who the Hubble telescope is named after. And do you have an oscillating universe, or is the universe like that firework you see? Are we going to have the Big Bang and everything goes out and then it just burns out eventually? Well, and why would you think that there might be an oscillating universe? Well, the argument was that, you know, where you have these little, I don't even know if they sell it, but they used to have these little paddle balls on a string, and the piece of rubber would bring it back, you know. Well, the thought was that maybe the gravitational forces in the matter in the universe, once it reached a certain point, I mean, that ball, you hit the thing out there, and it's going to go, but then it reaches a certain point, and, you know, the rubber band pulls it back. But the thought was not that a rubber band, but that the gravitational force in the matter in the universe, after the Big Bang expanded to a certain point, would pull things back. And then you'd have, I forget what they call it, but the Big Crunch, or, you know, you'd have the opposite of the Big Bang. And then the whole thing would start over again. And so, oscillating, you'd have it going out, and then you'd have it coming together. Now, they've actually done some recent work in the past, like 20 years, and they don't think that things are coming back. You know, the universe is going to be like the fireworks display. It's you know, it's all going to burn out eventually and just kind of, you know, die. But it's not coming back. So that speculation about an infinite universe as a response to the Big Bang Theory's claim that the universe had a finite beginning in time has pretty much been shot down by the latest science. So at any rate, but it's possible to, you know, talk about both sides of the Big Bang Theory. I'm going to stop. Okay, I got some time. The fifth way. Remember we saw that for Aristotle, things in nature have built-in purposes. You know, and now, you know, I skipped over the four causes, and maybe I shouldn't have. But one of Aristotle's causes is what we call a teleological cause. Or, in other words, it's a cause. If efficient causes push things toward a goal, a teleological cause kind of pulls something toward a goal. And one of the clearest illustrations is the development of an oak tree from an acorn, you know. And you've got efficient causes working along the way, you know, the seed, the acorn, I mean, it takes root, you have chemical processes happening, and it gets larger and larger and larger. But for Aristotle, besides those efficient causes, which is really the only thing we call causes, he says there's a teleological cause pulling the whole process along toward a given goal or end. And so this is why the design argument is called the teleological argument as opposed to the cosmological argument. Telos is an end or goal. So the design argument is also called the teleological argument for God's existence. Because the argument focuses on the fact that things have goals or purposes. And we get in the fifth way a very rudimentary version of this. And this is actually Aquinas' own argument. He says that an arrow doesn't have the intelligence in itself to direct itself toward a goal. Now you could say, well, today's missiles do. But remember, they had to be programmed by a human being and designed in order to do that. So Aquinas says, if something doesn't have intelligence in itself, and yet it seeks some end or goal, then it must have been directed to seek that end or goal by an external intelligence. In this case, the arrow has to be directed to seek the goal of hitting the target by, you know, the archer. So the idea is here's something pursuing an end. And so he says, likewise, things in nature that fulfill a goal or purpose can't direct themselves to have this purpose. They need to be directed by an outside intelligence, just like the arrow has to be directed to the target And who would that designer be but God? Now, William, well, okay, I'm not worried about Hume's reply. William Paley, and you saw an example earlier when I thought we were going to do this last week. I have a version of Paley's Natural Theology that I downloaded from Google Books, because I used to have a paper copy of it. And if you look at it, unlike a lot of philosophy books, it's got a lot of illustrations in it of various parts of the human body and animal bodies. And Paley's really big on the eye. And at one point he says, if we had no other example than the eye, we would still have to conclude that there was a designer. And he does, to a certain extent, address evolution. He says that even if we had things that replicated. And how does Paley, well, did you notice Paley says, I'm walking across the heath. Right here we walk across the field. In Scotland we walk across the heath. And he comes on a stone, and what does he say? Hey, for all I know, the stone might have been there forever. You know, nothing unusual about a stone laying in a field. But he says, if I were walking across it, and I came across a watch, then I would not have the same reaction, and I wouldn't accept the same explanation that, for all we know, the watch just has been there. He says, and why wouldn't I take that explanation for the watch? Or the same explanation as it did for the stone. And of course his answer is, well, the watch is an intricate mechanism with parts that function to bring about some goal or purpose. In this case, enable somebody to use it to tell time. And you could hold up something like this or this. And so here's the argument. The design argument is what logicians call an argument from analogy. Basically, you say, okay, two things are alike in several respects. That's your premise of the argument. Your conclusion is, okay, they're alike in some respects, therefore I conclude that there's a further respect that they're also alike. That's the general form of an argument from analogy. And of course, so Paley is saying things like, well, the watch and something like the human eye are both mechanisms where you've got several parts working together to fulfill a function. And so you bring out those similarities and you say, but wait a second, the watch didn't come into existence by itself. It wasn't always there. It needed a designer to design it to fulfill those functions and purposes. And so you can extend it and say, well, didn't the human eye then need a designer? And who else would the designer of the human eye be but God? Now, obviously, there are responses that evolution would give to this, that you have, over millions of years, the development from very simple eyes and through natural selection, the species that develop mutations with better eyes survived, the other ones didn't, and over the course of millions of years, we get something like the human eye, not as a design product on a designing board that was built by an artificer, but through a random process operating over millions of years, and a law that says things, there's natural selection involved. The species with the best adaptations survive. So you would say the species with the best size have survived. So there's this ongoing debate, but that's the way the contemporary version of this centers around things like that. And the most subtle versions of the design argument now point to some constants in physics that they say, well, nothing would work if these constants weren't exactly what they are. And of course you go back to saying, well, instead of being just